Hey students, it's Professor Gore. We're continuing with Module 2, talking about what happens right after the American Revolution. So if you remember in the previous lecture, we talked about basically the United States winning its independence from Britain against all odds when we were clearly at a disadvantage, being the United States. Of course, I say as an American, really, I wasn't alive during that time, but um, really, Britain had given up on deciding to continue the war after Lord Cornwallis had surrendered at the Battle of Yorktown. And so, really, a ragtag bunch of 13 colonies who really didn't have any money, didn't have the manufacturing capacity that the British did to produce firearms. They had to rely on loans from France and Holland, and borrowed from wealthy individuals and so forth to finance stuff. They didn't have a way to pay their soldiers. They had decided they were going to pay them in land. There was almost a mutiny after the war had ended, and they were going to overthrow or basically the Congress, or the Articles of Confederation government. And George Washington kind of read a riveting emotional letter to talk them out of it. So, really, the fact that those 13 colonies didn't break up into 13 separate nations is really incredible if you think about it, because they definitely had their own interest. And the fact that are loosely held together for long enough to make it to the actual Constitution is incredible in itself. So, for this lecture, I'm just going to cover the Articles of Confederation and what happens during that time. So, the Articles of Confederation government doesn't officially get ratified until the early 1780s. And the reason for that is they had to get some of the 13 colonies, particularly Connecticut and Virginia, to give up some of its land claims west of the Appalachians. It's kind of crazy that small Connecticut had land claims west of the Appalachians, but they did. And Virginia had a large amount of land claims. And so they had to convince them to give that to the federal government, and then the federal government in turn could sell it to pay back its debts. And that was really significant in our early nation, that those states were willing to do that, and that they were able to pay back some of its debts. Then in turn give away free land to American Revolutionary War veterans. So one thing that throughout American history that has made me proud to be an American is we haven't always done a good job, but a lot of times we have tried to take care of our veterans and different conflicts that we've been involved in. So, and we'll see that play out throughout the course. So, of course, the big phrase, the Declaration of Independence, was all men are created equal. So the first thing that you have happen right after the American Revolution is states are going to actually have to form new constitutions, because they didn't really have a constitution. They had a colonial charter from the King of England. So after the Declaration of Independence, states were encouraged to write new constitutions. You can see the dates here on abolition of slavery. We'll cover in just a minute. And so Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, they did this within 6 months of the Declaration of Independence being passed. Connecticut and Rhode Island altered their royal charters to take out reference to the king. So they were like, well, if it's not broke, let's don't fix it. Popular sovereignty was basically power to the people. In other words, the just powers come from the consent of the governed, which is the big thing from the Enlightenment and John Locke. Many people wanted to oppose anything that benefited the aristocracy, like in North Carolina. North Carolina, if you remember from Module 1, broke away from South Carolina. They were kind of poor tobacco farmer, former indentured servants, resented some of the wealthy planters of South Carolina. The Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776 abolished property ownership as a test of citizenship, which is significant because most places in the world at this time, the vast majority of them, you couldn't vote. One thing, didn't have any kind of democracy. And in places like England, where they did have voting, you had to own property. And so Pennsylvania does something revolutionary, is not only do they allowed all their male adult citizens to vote with property, they even removed the property qualification. So you could be just a tenant farmer working for somebody and still could vote. And that right there is nowhere else in the world had you had seen that at that time in history. They also created a unicameral legislature, which means just one house. So instead of having a House of Representatives and the Senate, they would have just one. that had complete power. There was no upper house and no governor who exercised veto power. Other provisions mandated an extensive system of elementary education and protected citizens from imprisonment for debt. So interesting that, and thankfully we don't have it in this day and age. But if you could not pay back your debts and you defaulted on it, they sent you to debtor's prison. So Pennsylvania got rid of that, and they also Pennsylvania got rid of their governor. And today, obviously, Pennsylvania has a governor like every other state. But the cool thing is that Pennsylvania mandated elementary education. So New England and the middle colonies, or what becomes the middle states right after the American Revolution, had the most educated population in the world. And that's because of the Puritan and other religious heritage that wanted everybody to be able to read the Bible. That continued even right after the American Revolution, that Pennsylvania wanted everybody to be able to read. That's significant because an educated population makes a more educated voting population as well. John Adams called for a federal government that had two House legislature or a bicameral legislature. He's actually overseas for this time, going to be the ambassador to England. And he called for a system in which legislatures would make laws, the executive would administer them, and the judiciary would enforce them. Interesting, because that's what we end up having. Now, they actually got the idea from other people at the Constitutional Convention, such as James Madison and others, not so much John Adams, but he actually argued for what we presently have. Conservative patriots endorsed Adams' view for a bicameral legislature because it preserved a representative government while restricting popular power, but they hesitated to give the veto power to the governors because they recalled the arbitrary conduct of royal governors and feared executive authority. Most states did follow Adams' suggestion about retaining traditional property qualifications for voting. So John Adams thought the reason why you had to own property to vote is they thought that you kind of had to have skin in the game, so to speak, to actually vote. So if you look right here at this map, this shows you the northern states. So New England abolishes slavery, and you look at the middle colonies, or what becomes the middle states, besides Connecticut, Rhode Island, gradually emancipated their slaves. So Rhode Island and Connecticut didn't have a lot of slaves to begin with, but they gradually emancipated them pretty quickly. And then the other states, you see that that they don't really have emancipation, not until the United States Civil War. So the Quakers, if you remember them from Module 1, they were opposed to slavery. And people like John Adams and Benjamin Rush and others were opposed to slavery. In fact, Benjamin Rush created the first anti-slavery society in American history. So one of the things that's going to be frustrating in American history is that slavery was at probably its weakest point in American history right after the American Revolution. You had about 10,000 slaves that fought for the British and gained independence. A lot of them fled to Canada. Some went to England. Some went to the Caribbean. Some went to Florida, which is controlled by the Spanish. A lot of them intermarried with like the Seminole Indians and so forth. So what do? They didn't want the southern states to break away, and they compromised on the issue of slavery. And that's going to forever haunt American history, because we probably would have healed as a nation much sooner if we'd abolished slavery in the 1780s or 1790s in American history. But so let's go through this. So this is the term Mason-Dixon line. You'll hear that and so forth. I heard that growing up in the South. Oh, north of the Mason-Dixon line. That's supposed to be the North. Separated basically Maryland and Pennsylvania. If you look at it, if you drew a line all the way across our country, it would cut across Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. That's not really the case. But they used to say that the Mason-Dixon line is what's separated the slave and free states. So really, it's the Ohio River that goes south of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. That's the northern border of Kentucky that really is the dividing line. All right. So talk about state constitutions. So one thing you'll hear throughout this course, particularly all the way through the American Civil War, is this idea of popular sovereignty. What that basically means is power to the people. So the people get to decide and vote on things. So I always ask all my students that I've ever taught is that I ask you to do three things after my class, if you haven't already. I expect you to register to vote. I expect you to be informed, and I expect you to vote. And that is exercising popular sovereignty. So the fact that we get to vote on local elections for local officials, state officials, county officials, and at the federal government level. So that is popular sovereignty. So people get to decide and vote on things. As I mentioned, we talked about the property qualifications. If you look at here at around 1800, these are the states that still had property qualifications. You look at the next color down, they just had to pay taxes. And then Kentucky and Vermont lead the way with universal white male suffrage. Now, as you know, racism is going to be an issue throughout American history, and other non-European groups are not going to have the right to vote, whether that be free blacks living in the North, whether it be Native Americans. Native Americans weren't even considered citizens at this time. That doesn't happen until 1924. Then you look at 1830. So this will be in Module 3, but between 1800 and 1830, the property qualifications is only in North Carolina and Tennessee. Most states have adopted just taxpayer qualification. And now, instead of just Vermont and Kentucky, you have a few other states that have joined forces with them for universal white male suffrage. Eventually, that will change by the 1832 election, where they'll all be like that. So let's talk about what is representative democracy. So every one of the 13 colonies before the American Revolution had a tradition of governing themselves, and they also had some form of representation with their government. That was one thing that they pushed for with the leading to the American Revolution, is they wanted no taxation without representation. They wanted representation in Parliament because they're used to representing themselves. So property owning men getting the right to vote, to elect officials that are going to vote for things that hopefully have their interest. So they represent their own, elected their own representatives, and pass laws to keep peace within their communities. The purpose of government is to maintain law and order and advance society. And so you have to have law and order for society to exist without anarchy. And so, of course, they're going to pass local laws and state laws, and then eventually we'll talk about federal laws. So this representative democracy is going to carry over into the Articles of Confederation, which was a representative government. It was a weak representative government, but it still was a representative government. And then it's going to make much stronger when we get to the next lecture, talking about the actual Constitution. So one of the things that we've talked about is what the state constitution and state governments are going to establish. So what each of these states are going to list is basically, it may be slightly different, but similar to our Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So if you don't like our Constitution, we can amend it with 2/3 vote in Congress, particularly the Senate. So we've done it 27 times. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments. States basically establish a state Bill of Rights. May not have the exact same ones as our first 10, but for the most part, it was similar. They also established what these inalienable rights were, like, for instance, a trial by jury. I've served on 2 juries myself. It's an important part of our democracy that we have a legal system where you are tried by a jury of your peers. They also, because when the American Revolution ended, we did not have religious freedom established in all 13 states. Most of the states, you had to pay taxes to a particular church. Like if you lived in Virginia, you had to pay taxes to the Anglican Church. And so after the British are defeated, the Anglican Church in the United States becomes the Episcopalian Church. And so Thomas Jefferson, who was a deist, and the Baptists in Virginia helped push for getting rid of the mandated taxes to the Church of England. So you could certainly give, and Christians call it tithing, to these whatever church denomination you want to give to, or religious entity, but you weren't forced to, and that's significant. And so eventually every state is going to write that in, where they're eventually going to establish religious liberty. They don't have it everywhere in all 13 states in 1783. Some of it doesn't get it until 1790s and into the first couple of years of the 1800s. So that is significant. Separation of powers. Typically, these state governments are going to have two House legislature. Arkansas has that. Texas has that. Most states, I'm pretty sure every state in the union has that today. Executive powers to elect a governor. All 50 states have a governor today. Judicial power system of courts. Every state in the United States has a state court system, and you actually have a state Supreme Court, and so forth. So forth. All white males with property could vote, and then of course there's a couple states that made it where you just had to be a taxpayer, and then eventually Kentucky and Vermont made it where universal adult white male suffrage. And so the reason for that is they thought that property owners had a larger stake in government than the poor and propertyless, which there is an argument to that. Of course, things have changed a lot in our society, and you don't necessarily see that as much. But back then, land ownership was everything. That was the American dream. And that's why so many thousands and millions of immigrants come over to the United States, because they want to own property. And elected officials typically had higher qualifications than the voters. So the founding fathers were the most educated, the most qualified people in society. Not until you get to the Jacksonian era that you start seeing kind of average Joe frontiersmen getting elected to government officials positions. All right, so we covered popular sovereignty. These state constitutions are also going to have limits of government. That's going to be significant because we're going to establish that in the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. Civil rights and liberties, we're going to establish that in the Bill of Rights, and then other amendments later in American history. And then you also have separation of powers between the governor, the state legislature, and the state judicial system. We're going to implement that at the federal level as well with the Articles of Confederation and the constitutional government. All right, so what about women? This has been a great opportunity in American history to give women the right to vote. Few men listened. In fact, John Adams' beloved wife, Abigail, wrote to him and told him to remember the ladies. Now, he loved and respected Abigail dearly, and she definitely made him a better politician and so forth for wisdom. Arguably one of the best first ladies we've had in terms of intellect. He actually wrote back to her laughing. So that shows you the day and age for that. Women don't get the right to vote, unfortunately, until the 19th Amendment in 1920. So, but really nowhere else in the world did you have women have the right to vote, because very few places even had voting anywhere in the world, and then certainly didn't have women. So it would have been extremely revolutionary for the United States to give women the right to vote, but it would have made American history a little bit and quite a bit easier. We never had this women's rights movement later in American history that we'll cover. So, but a lot of women, there weren't really any women speaking out openly at this time. They should have the right to vote. That will change with the Second Great Awakening that we'll cover in Module 3. Anyway, so we'll talk about women's rights reformers such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, pushing for citizenship, pushing the right to vote, pushing for better education for women. All that will be pushed for, but into the 1800s, not in the 1780s, besides a few women in private at that time. That's going to change. That's going to be a big aspect of American history. So what was women's roles, though, after the American Revolution? Well, this will be important. It will be on a quiz or test at some point. It's this idea of called Republican motherhood. And what Republican motherhood was, that it's women's role, since you're not voting and you're not involved in government at the local, state, or federal level, then your job is, this idea of Republican motherhood is, your job is to raise good, loyal, moral boys and girls citizens. Okay. That was, we look at that in today's society and probably kind of laugh at that, but it was a very important role. You think about how much your own mother has shaped you as a person, and I think about how my own mother has shaped me. You think about the morality that mothers teach across the world to their children, and if your mom is patriotic, chances are you're probably going to be patriotic. Especially if your mom and dad are patriotic and so forth. So very important role, educate the children, teach them to be good, moral, loyal, patriotic citizens. Okay, so that's Republican motherhood. Okay, so as I covered this at the end of talking about the Treaty of Paris, a lot of loyalists leave, about 100,000 left during or after the war. We have actually don't have exact numbers. Like I said, they didn't do censuses back then. Those that did stay, and even those that left, suffered heavy financial losses. And so, like I said, a lot of it was their property was seized and sold. Treaty of Paris said that we were supposed to give it back. We don't, and that'll be an issue when we get to Jay's treaty at the end of Module 2. But here's an interesting thing, and really I think makes the American Revolution unique compared to other revolutions in world history. It does not drastically alter the structure of world society. It also didn't really change much socially. You look at the French Revolution. I mean, they were, guillotining all these rich, wealthy, affluent people, members of the high clergy of the church. It really changed the social structure of France. You look at the Bolshevik Revolution that we cover in U.S. History 2 in Russia. I mean, communism drastically changes the social structure of Russia. Same thing with Mao Zedong's revolution in China. Any other communist revolutions. The Latin American revolutions, if you ever take world history too, we talk about that. That's a little bit different. You basically have the Peninsulars replaced by the Creoles, but overall the social structure doesn't really change that much. The United States Revolution didn't really alter the structure. I mean, yeah, you had wealthy loyalists that fled and lost their wealth, but you still had a lot of wealthy patriots who nothing changed. So that's significant. All right, so let's talk about what the Articles of Confederation consisted of. It's often thought that Articles of Confederation, oh, it was terrible, it sucked. Compared to the Constitution, it did suck, but overall, no, not really, because for one thing, it kept the 13 states together. That is significant. That is, if it did nothing else, then it's a great accomplishment. Secondly, it signed the Treaty of Paris 1783, one of the greatest treaties the United States has ever seen in its history. I mean, we got everything east of the Mississippi River, south of Canada, north of Florida. Thirdly, it passed the Northwest Ordinances, the lands of 1785, the Northwest Ordinances of 1787. And those were great, great laws that were passed by the Articles of Confederation. So that's at least 4 solid accomplishments. On paper, compared to the Constitution, yeah, you're comparing a much better product, but it was not as terrible as often thought. So it is the first federal constitution. You will have to know it for a quiz. You will have to know it for the test. And so it is based on the ideas of the Declaration of Independence. And so it finally passed in March of 1781, a couple years before the Treaty of Paris is signed. Because, like I said, they had to get those Virginia and Connecticut and a couple others to give up their land claims west of the Appalachians. There is no executive branch. Mistake. All right. So government is basically it's very much decentralized. The states hold the vast majority of the power, where today the federal government holds the majority of the power. So back then it was the opposite, and so the states are loosely governed, and they kind of got to do, for the most part, what they wanted. The federal government was there to protect them for war and handle trade issues. That's about it. Okay. So each state was independent, conducted their own affairs. A lot of times they even negotiated their own trade agreements, which is very confusing. You need one uniform trade policy for dealing with the United States of America as opposed to 13 different ones. Okay. So we'll see that our federal government is going to be too weak on the Articles of Confederation to handle a problem such as Shays' Rebellion, which was huge. Huge in significance. It actually gets put down fairly easily, but the ripple effect of it is tremendous. So states have more power, would unite in times of crisis, which Shays' Rebellion ended up leading to a members meeting. And so when they get to the Constitutional Convention, they were originally going to revise the articles. They end up just getting rid of it. And it's basically just cooperation, which would be nice today. So you end up having just one branch. Each colony or each state had one vote per state, regardless if you're Virginia or Rhode Island. So the biggest and the smallest. The Congress were the ones that declare war. Okay, so today in the Constitution, the president asks Congress for a declaration of war, and Congress actually votes to go to war. Congress could build an army and navy. Supposed to settle disputes among states, are kind of like an arbitrator between the two, and it does set up a monetary system. So thankfully, we did have kind of like a uniform monetary system because during the war you might have different types of currency. Not good. Okay, so the states, they were supposed to gather taxes and then give a portion of that taxes to the federal government. That is the great weakness of the Articles of Confederation. If you get nothing else about the weakness of the Articles of Confederation, understand that its greatest weakness is it had no ability to tax. What state is going to gather taxes and not keep all of it for themselves? Oh, I'm supposed to give up some of it. Well, how much am I supposed to give up? Well, North Carolina's not giving up that much. Why would I give up more than what I have to? Terrible. Their only source of revenue was selling land west of the Appalachians. That is the great weakness of the Articles of Confederation. We don't, I mean, I don't know of anybody that says, man, I can't wait to pay my taxes when they get up in the morning, but taxes are a necessary function of society. And it's necessary for society to function, I should say. So without the ability to tax, you're going to have tremendous problems. Okay. All right. So we've covered that. States promised to obey Congress, although they didn't really hand over their taxes the way they were supposed to. And so, anyway, settle disputes, handle war problems, and so forth. So, weaknesses of it is you don't have like a House of Representatives where representatives are based on population of size of the state. So, like California and Texas are the two largest states in terms of population, along with New York. They have the most representatives in the House of Representatives. And the Senate has 2 senators per state. You don't have that. So that's why we're going to compromise with the constitutional rules. We'll see in the next lecture. I've already covered the taxation policy, the weakest. It really couldn't regulate foreign interstate commerce. They, on theory, could do it, but didn't really have any backing to do it. No executive powers to enforce acts of Congress. No national court system, so we have no national Supreme Court. Amendment could only be consent of all states. Think about this. If you're with your friends on a Friday night, you're trying to figure out where you're going to go out to eat. How difficult would it be with 13 friends to have one consensus about where to go eat? Unless you live near a Whataburger, then the consensus is going to be automatic. But if you have 13 friends, it's going to be extremely difficult. That's why you have 50% or more in Congress today to get something passed, or if it's an amendment, it's got to be 2/3. You don't have unanimous consent. Otherwise, we never would have had an amendment in American history. You had to have 9 out of 13 required to pass laws. That would have been difficult. Usually what happens if you got a group of friends, you've got whoever's the most dominant alpha dog is who's going to make the decision. So those are weaknesses. Okay. As I've covered, no taxation abilities. All right. You had to have 13 out of 13 states to agree to amend the Constitution, and so forth. And also no judicial branch. That was kind of confusing about what its role was going to be with the Constitutional Convention. And of course, we'll talk about in Module 3 with Marbury versus Madison that's going to establish what the Supreme Court's powers is going to be, and that's going to be judicial review. All right, so if you look at this is kind of an interesting pie chart because later in the next lecture, I'm going to show you a pie chart with what the constitutional government is going to be. So really, if you looked at it, 80% of the power of the Articles of Confederation is in the states' hands. Only 20%, if that, is in the government hands. When we go to the Constitutional Convention, at the end of that, it's going to be 60% federal government power, 40% state. Now today, it's kind of swung more to even larger federal government power, and that balance between state and federal power will always be an issue throughout U.S. history. It's one of the longest issues in American history. So I've gone over this. I want to emphasize this again because you will have this potentially on a quiz question or a test question. Did the Articles of Confederation provide a way to tax the states? No. Okay. They were supposed to give the taxes over, but they weren't going to do that. And so let's look at the debt after the war. So our debt was at 11.7 million, which is a whole lot of money for that day and age. State debt was even worse, 21.5 million. And then our federal domestic debt, what we owe to ourselves, which actually, if you look at today, the date I'm making this lecture, our debt's like 19 trillion and counting. We actually owe even more than that to ourselves because we printed paper money against ourselves. About $80 million, give or take. The other problem is these forts on the frontier. I covered this at the end of the last lecture, talking about the Treaty of Paris 1783. Britain was supposed to get out of frontier forts. They're still living in them on U.S. soil. That'll be an issue that we'll get to when we get to George Washington's presidency. And that's going to lead to Jay's Treaty, which is going to be a very controversial treaty in American history. You look at disputed territory. Technically, Britain gave us this territory north of Florida, east of the Mississippi River, but the Spanish claimed that, and that's going to be an issue. Also, there are some pretty powerful Native American tribes that live there. You have the Cherokee, the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and then a little bit of that into Florida would be the Seminoles. So the five civilized tribes, as you may know in American history, get forcibly removed to Oklahoma that we'll cover in Module 3. They lay claim to that. And so the Americans are laying claim on paper, but unless you control the area militarily, you really don't control it. And of course, Spain is going to claim it. This conflict with Spain will be an issue that we'll deal with both at the end of Module 2 and into Module 3 as well until we finally buy Florida. All right, so let's talk about problems with Native Americans and Native American conflict. Actually, I'm really going to cover that in a later lecture. But if you can see right here from this map, it's a good map to illustrate what land the United States acquired. So we acquired Western New York, most of it from the Fort Stanwix Treaty, again, from the Iroquois. A lot of them flee to Canada. Also, the northwest part of Pennsylvania. We're going to get most of Ohio from the Treaty of Fort Greenville, which I'll cover in a later lecture. But that's a big deal with the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. But we'll cover that at a later lecture. So I've covered state claims to Western lands. You can see these states where they claimed, and so what they had to get them to give up with the Articles of Confederation we've already talked about. So in 1783, you really have what was the north of the Ohio River Valley, is what at that time they called the Northwest Territory. Okay, today it's the Midwest. Okay, so if you remember this, the Midwest today is the Northwest Territory at this time in American history. The Old Southeast, okay, or the Old Southwest is what we call the Deep South today, and so forth. So let's talk about two really good things that the Articles of Confederation government was able to accomplish. The first one is the landowners of 1785. If you've ever flown over the Midwest, and I've flown over the Midwest once, it's a very gridded land structure. All the roads are very parallel and perpendicular to one another. It's just very uniform and makes logical sense because the land ordinance of 1785 broke it up into rectangular or square plots. And how they established townships made sense. That's why a lot of the Midwestern towns are really easy to get around in. It's because how they made them with the land ordinance of 1785, and they continued it throughout their history. So the grid system was invented by, not invented, but Jefferson's the one who came with the idea to use the grid system for this bill. It's very structured, and it makes logical sense. It worked out really well. And so it's very much an orderly fashion to expand west until you run into Native Americans. But Native Americans aside, you could break up a piece of land very orderly if they're not living there. Of course, we'll talk about in a later lecture how Native Americans are going to put a beat down on the United States trying to go into the land. So if you look right here, it shows you kind of how they divide up sections. And you could, if you had a little more money, hey, you could purchase 320 acres. If not, you could purchase 180 or maybe only 40 acres. 40 acres is a lot of land today, but man, back then it was like you had made it. If you owned 40 acres, that was like you had a ranch in West Texas or somewhere. Or a mountain cabin and near the Buffalo River in Arkansas. I mean, golly, you had made it with having that kind of land. And so they also every 14th plot or 16th plot, they made a town. In that town, they also reserved set aside for school, which made the Midwest eventually the most educated part of our country, but outside of New England. So it sold for about $1 to $2 an acre to pay back our debts. Now, you got to realize $1 to $2 is more worth a whole lot more than it is now, but still, $1 to $2 was a credible deal for land, and nowhere else in the world could you find land that cheap that was worth anything. Okay. All right. The next one that was really good was what's called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So land ordinance is a logical way to divide and plot the Midwest or the Northwest Territory. Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is how is a new area going to become a state? And so this is significant because they could make it where any new state is a lesser state to the original 13. They didn't make it that way. They made it where each state that came in the Union, such as Arkansas and Texas, would be equal to every other state in the Union. And so they also made it how can they even get close to statehood? Okay. And so this is a great bill that was passed. It sold large blocks. And a lot of times you might have real estate developers who come out there and buy the plots and then sell them and subdivide them. And so these new states, like I said, would be equal to the original 13. Of course, this is going to lead to tremendous violence with Native Americans that we'll cover. So let's look at what it does. How do you become a state? All right. First step, when you get enough people in the area, Congress is going to appoint a governor, not the people, but this particular time, Congress appoints the governor to govern the territory. Okay. Second step, once you get 5,000 free adult males, boom, you can elect a legislature. Third step, once you get 60,000 settlers, you can apply for statehood. Okay. And they made it where no more than 5 states. So Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois are from the Northwest Territory. Part of Minnesota, but it's not all of Minnesota. The rest of it's part of Louisiana Purchase. Okay. So you're also going to, we covered these disputes. Spain is also going to have forts on U.S. soil too, and that's going to lead to some conflict. And we'll cover what's happening in the American Southwest in a later lecture. But Spain is chilling out there. They're still controlling that. Eventually, Mexico is going to. The Mexicans are going to get independence from them in 1820. But they're still doing the Presidio system. Still have the old missions. Still very sparsely populated, but still have some settlements. Spanish are still trying to get Native Americans to adopt Spanish ways, like you remember from Module 1. But other than, they tried to avoid conflict with the Comanches because the Comanches would have put a beat down on them. But they're pretty much just living much like they had, as you learned about in Module 1. Just fast forward, as more and more Spanish settlers come, you might have a few more settlers and then natural birth rates and so forth. But other than that, nothing real exciting is going on in the American Southwest. All right, last thing we're going to cover in this lecture is Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion is a turning point in American history because it causes the founding fathers to realize, the Arkansas Confederation government is not going to cut it. It's not going to be able to put down insurrection, and we might have anarchy. Let's try to meet to figure out how to amend it, and they end up throwing it out and creating our Constitution. All right, so what caused Shays' Rebellion? Well, Daniel Shays actually was a decorated American Revolutionary War veteran, served as a captain, had been given a sword by the French leader who was good friends with George Washington to help train our troops, Marquis de Lafayette, and he was very much proud of that. In fact, he used that sword to lead his own rebellion. Daniel Shay was broke after the war, like so many other Revolutionary War soldiers. He didn't get paid and wasn't given land in Ohio. So gold and silver, which the British had controlled nearly all of it before the American Revolution. Now, after the war, the United States is short on gold and silver, and we're trying to print paper money, and that's kind of a disaster with financial problems. So farmers in Western Massachusetts couldn't really pay their taxes in gold and silver. And so they said, well, hey, we'll pay our taxes, but can we pay it in crops? Can we pay it in livestock? Well, Sam Adams actually was the governor of Massachusetts at the time, and the Massachusetts state legislature says, no, you need to pay in gold and silver because we have to pay our debts that Massachusetts owed, probably more debt than any other of the 13 states. We need to gold and silver so we can pay back our debts. And so Daniel Shays and others, as they couldn't pay back their taxes, the tax officials and the courts would come seize their property. People could be thrown into debtor's prison. Daniel Shays actually thrown in debtor's prison 2 or 3 times in his life. And so he leads these Western Massachusetts farmers in a rebellion, and they seize the courts, they shut them down, stop foreclosure from happening, and threaten to fight against the Massachusetts government. So Sam Adams raises up basically what is the Massachusetts National Guard. It's called the Massachusetts State Militia, but it was the National Guard. And they face off against Daniel Shays and convinces him and the others to disband and go home. Okay, so how does that lead to the Constitutional Convention? It convinces the founding fathers that, wow, we need to figure out a way to handle taxes, and the Articles of Confederation just doesn't do it. And so we need a stronger federal government that can handle and put down any kind of insurrection and anarchy. And so that is what the significance of Shays' Rebellion is. It has been on, it'll be on a quiz, depending on which questions you get, the quiz that you take. It will be on a test, and it's on the AP US History exam every year. The Shays' Rebellion is a big deal in American history because the significance is it causes the Articles of Confederation to end and the Constitutional Convention to happen and our new government to go into place. All right, gone to that. And definitely want to highlight that. We'll end this lecture and we'll cover the Constitution on the next one.